Our next panel in this session, as I indicated, focusing on gender roles and the unequal status of women in African food systems. We all know how important gender is, and it was addressed throughout the previous session by all the panelists. We all know that 50% of farmers on the African continent are smallholder women farmers. We know that 80% of the food that we eat on the African continent has passed through the hands of women. We're very privileged to have a high-level panel participating with Dr. Vanjiru Kamua-Rattenberg, the Executive Director of Award, the African Women in Agricultural Research and Development based in Kenya, as our lead speaker. This will be followed by three panelists, Professor Justin Pita from the Ivory Coast, Dr. Elizabeth Mkandawire, originally from Malawi, currently based at the University of Pretoria, and Professor Margaret Mangeni from Makerere University in Uganda. Dr. Farai Kavatsurua, a postgraduate fellow working with the University of Pretoria, will provide a summary for the panel at the end. Without any further ado, it's my great pleasure then to ask Dr. Vanjiru Kamau-Rattenberg to do a presentation of the lead paper on gender-responsive food systems transformation in Africa. Thank you very much, Vanjiru.
Hello, everybody. I hope the audio is clear.
We can see and hear you clearly.
Brilliant. So allow me to share my screen. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you and getting to present some of my thoughts on this topic. I want to start with a couple of arguments that hopefully lay the groundwork for what I thought we would talk about today, or what I wanted to share with you today. The connected circularity of the food system requires an interdisciplinary research approach that does seek transformative solutions to African challenges. However, as a concept note for this track highlights, much of the food systems research has focused on global food systems with relatively little attention paid to the particularities within the African context. Today, I want to argue that gender relations are a core feature that shapes the particularity of the African context when it comes to our food system. Specifically, I want to argue that African women are at the heart of and essential to our food systems, and conversely, agriculture is important to African women's lives and livelihoods. Unfortunately, while African women continue to invest heavily in feeding the continent, gender inequalities remain a defining feature of our food systems. Whether they are last in the family to eat, blocked from owning land, or entirely ignored by researchers, extension workers, and even policymakers, gender inequality, and specifically discrimination against women, is a key driver of our broken food systems on the continent. And I worry that even today, still too few are connecting the dots between gender inequality and hunger on the continent. Globally, we know that women account for more than 40% of the agricultural workforce in developing countries, often working longer hours and taking on more labor-intensive tasks, such as weeding and tending to livestock. For example, we know that weeding a single hectare of sorghum by hand can take around 324 hours of labor. Yet while women bear the burden of drudgery on farms, they do so without access to many of the same resources as men, facing a yield gap of up to 30% as a result. And here one of the gaps and the resources that women especially don't have access to is access to the land itself, the ownership of the land itself. We know that, and research shows that, providing women with inputs and services that meet their needs if we did, by providing women with inputs, the inputs and services that meet their needs, total agricultural output in developing countries could rise by up to 4%. And so I want to argue that we cannot continue neglecting the vital contribution of women in agriculture if we are to have any hope of improving Africa's food systems. This means addressing the underappreciated and vital role of women, not just in producing and preparing the food for their families, but also in conducting and leading the scientific research needed to enhance the production and equitable distribution of food for all. Within this presentation, I want to pay particular attention to issues of agricultural research. I think it is important to begin with a recognition that all agricultural value chains begin at the research phase, and as such, agricultural research is a key component of our food systems. While there's a lot of focus on production and even markets, it's important to acknowledge that researchers make decisions that have massively gendered implications across the food system. To effectively fix our broken food systems today, I argue that all scientists must have the skills and commitments to address the needs and priorities of the diversity of male and female farmers and end users of agricultural research across the entire food system. And here I think it is important then to reiterate what is gender responsiveness and what does the gender responsive agricultural research ecosystem look like. So let me reiterate, a gender responsive agricultural research ecosystem responds to the needs and priorities of the diversity of men and women who are across the entire agricultural value chain. There are two particular ways that we at Award, the organization that I head, look at gender responsiveness. We look at external gender responsiveness and internal gender responsiveness. For external, we're asking our research institutions and our scientists, who are you solving problems for? How have you engaged them to understand what solutions they need and how they need those solutions delivered? There's also a component of internal gender responsiveness. And here we're looking particularly at research institutions and asking, does a research institution provide a conducive environment so that the diversity of men and women working there can bring their best to the research process? For today's presentation, I want to focus particularly on internal gender responsiveness, with a recognition that some of my colleagues who will speak after me will bring more of a focus on what we call external gender responsiveness. And here I want to go in with a recognition that women account for less than 30% of the world's total researchers. This is global, the global picture. And only 4% of these are making it to the top levels of their professions. A recent study found that it may take up to 320 years before an equal number of men and women are working in senior research roles worldwide. And here I'd want to say, I think we can all agree that we don't have that kind of time to spend. And so we need to be accelerating our efforts. The research also shows that women scientists are less likely than men to publish their work in journals. And when they do publish papers, they are less likely to be the lead investigator of the research. The result is that women's achievements in science, research, and development slip through the equality gap. The World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, reports that only 30.5% of patent applications have one woman inventor. Not even a lead woman inventor, but just one woman inventor. And so the picture is grim globally. Unfortunately, it's grim also for the continent. In 2008, Award partnered with IFPRI's Agricultural Science and Technology Indicators Program, ASTI, to understand the talent pipeline for African women in agricultural research. We found that women are underrepresented in the leadership roles where the priorities are set, decisions made, and resources allocated for research on the continent. And this is why, since 2008, Award African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, I should clarify, has invested in accelerating the careers of the continent's female agricultural scientists. In addition to leadership training, we also unlock the wisdom of an older generation of scientists through an intensive mentoring program and support African women scientists rise to the top of their scientific careers by helping them build the skills needed to raise resources for their cutting edge research. Award and ASTI recently partnered again to create a data portal tracking progress on commitments to increase the numbers of women in agricultural research on the continent. And here you are able to see a screenshot of that portal. If you go to the ASTI website and click backstroke gender, you will have full access to the full set of data that we are that we curate together. Across sub-Saharan Africa, just 1 in 4, oh, sorry, here, I can move back. Across sub-Saharan Africa, just 1 in 4 agricultural researchers are women, and the data indicates that it does indicate that that there have been some countries that have made tremendous progress between 2008 and 2014. And here you will take a look and notice that Tanzania, Senegal, Mauritania in particular stand out. Still, a broader look at our reality across the continent shows that we're nowhere near gender parity as a continent. And there remains a lot of work to do in improving these particular numbers. And this is why Award continues to invest in building a more gender responsive agricultural research system for the continent, because we really do recognize that we can't build a robust food system for the continent without addressing gender inequality. And we need to be working to ensure that African women are part of the decision makers who determine priorities and allocate resources for agricultural research, a key component of Africa's food system. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and try and enter into a conversation also about some of the things we're looking at and learning as we look at COVID. And if you give me just a second, looking at how do we build a gender responsive food system in the context of COVID-19? And here we can agree that COVID-19 has fundamentally challenged everything about how we think about work, everywhere, including work and research. African research institutions are challenged to be even more relevant and produce research that responds to the needs and priorities of the diversity of men and women across agricultural value chains, even more. We also know that proponents of gender responsive research, such as Award, have been arguing on the need to accommodate women's gender roles and recognizing the need to create environments, research environments that accord better work-life balance for researchers, and especially for women researchers. And let me explain a little bit here. If you'll allow me to introduce the language of the private sphere and the public sphere, which is often used by gender experts to explain how society disadvantages women. Scientific research is performed in the public sphere with an assumption that what happens in our homes, the private sphere, is irrelevant to the research process. With lockdowns, COVID-19 has sent most of us, if not all researchers, back to our homes, and a space that's often considered the private sphere, and we're now all doing public sphere work in private sphere spaces. By merging what is usually in the public sphere with a public sphere, COVID-19 has laid bare the importance, for example, of care work in the household and its unpaid nature. I think whether you are a mother or a father, you are trying to grapple with homeschooling your children, trying to grapple with the care work that comes with, and the balancing act that all too many women, and especially women researchers, have had to be balancing. So COVID-19 has had some good news and some bad news also. We are now seeing research institutions embracing the kinds of accommodations that we've been advocating for decades now. From remote working to flexible hours, virtual conferences such as this one, that makes it possible to limit long trips away from home. Um, and even online meetings, department meetings that then are more inclusive in that more decisions are not being made in corridors between 2 or 3 people. It's their decision-making processes that are more transparent as a result of everyone working from home. And so there's accommodations that institutions are making today that they haven't always been willing to make. And we think that it's going to be important to maintain those gains, to lock in those gains in terms of building workplaces that are more inclusive. Still, we need to be careful because research is showing that working from home is actually also impacting women more than men, as women do still continue to bear an increased burden of care um, in the household. Recent research is showing that while male researcher productivity has increased, publication submissions by women have actually declined sharply since the pandemic began. And so on the whole, I think COVID-19 represents a unique opportunity to consolidate the gains that both individual researchers and research institutions have made as they have made accommodations for all of us to be able to work from home. But we must also be careful to see the ways that some of these accommodations can, if not mitigated, exacerbate already existing imbalances. Allow me to stop there and hand over back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Panjeru. As always, your passion, your dedication and commitment to continue the leadership for gender mainstreaming and to make sure that we really take everything of women and in the context of gender into consideration of moving forward in food systems transformation. The next panelists, we have 3 panelists in this session. The first one is Professor Justin Pieter, who will share a case study from West Africa with us. Thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you, Franz. I hope you can hear me well. All right, as Francis said, I'm going to share a case studies. I would like to emphasis of the need of providing gender inclusive participation with the case studies of cassava. I would like to say that, unlike Wanjiro, I am not a gender specialist, but I would like to talk with you about what I'm living. So if you may allow me, I will just quickly share my screen. So with only one slide, I would like really to explain to you why we really need to include everybody, women, men, and all the main actors of the cassava value chain. So I wanted to emphasize the case of cassava and show that cassava is so important for Africa. And it's the staple food for more than 500 million inhabitants in Africa. And this cassava is also threatened by diseases. We have the cassava mosaic disease here and the cassava brown streak disease here. Both of them reduce tremendously the production of cassava. And African cassava mosaic disease, the cassava is planted. And cassava, unlike cassava mosaic disease, cassava brown streak disease is only in East Africa and is spreading toward West Africa. And if our data remains good, you will see that it started in Uganda in the 2006 years and is spreading right now in 2020. The disease is right now in Central Africa. and moving toward West Africa. Here, you see that the greener the map is, more cassava cultivation is happening. And you have Nigeria here, a country of more than 90 million inhabitants, where 80% of the population is depending on cassava for daily consumption. If this cassava brown disease reach here to Nigeria, with destruction of 90 to 100%, it's going to be a big problem. It's going to be a big insecurity problem, big problem for food security. So that kind of highlight the importance of working to practically. And we know that in the cassava sector, women constitute more than the most important actors. And when we know, what we know is that until now, women remain at the margin of power and decision making, especially in agricultural research leadership, where priorities are set, resources allocated, and policy decision made. And in the program I'm leading for WAVE, the program noticed the importance of gender mainstreaming at the onset of the program, during the inception meeting of the program, which is implemented in 10 countries: Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, and DRC. As 9 of the 10 senior scientists who are serving as country directors are men. So we have 10 country directors. Out of the 10, we have only 1 female. And we are seeing the difference she's making, because she understands what is really critical to mitigate the problem, because she can really discuss with the women the main actors. So while the evidence confirms that gender diversity in research teams lead to higher quality research, studies indicate that 25% of agricultural researchers in most African countries are female, with most concentrated in the lower ranks of the career sector, of the career ladder. So given the threat at stake, you guys saw this disease. You guys saw that if we don't do anything, we're going to have a major food security crisis in West Africa whenever this disease will hit Africa. So we think that it's important to try to mitigate such pandemic by allowing the major actor to participate. And that is what we are trying to do at WAVE, by training more female, by involving more female farmer group in trainings and all that. And we know we have only 5 minutes. We'll be able to discuss more of that later, but it's critical if we will want to have good effect and work on food security. I would like to stop here and give it back to France.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you very much for the case study, clearly aligned with the overarching framework and the indications that Wanjiru has also given. Our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Mkandawire. She is currently the coordinator of the United Nations Academic Impact Hub for SDG 2, which is hosted at the University of Pretoria, and working closely with Professor Cheryl Hendricks. From the 1st of October, she will be joining the FSNet Africa team, and we're very excited and look forward to welcome her officially in joining us. She will speak to us about towards a conceptual framework for gender and African food systems using international and continental agreements. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We're looking forward to your input.
Thank you, Prof. I really appreciate the opportunity to share and hopefully get some feedback on the conceptual framework we've been working on for integrating gender in the African food system. So I wanted to start off by walking you through an average day of a woman living in rural central Malawi. Let's call her Toko. Toko wakes up every morning at 4 a.m. to go and fetch water, and she might queue for up to 2 hours waiting for her turn. At about 6 a.m., she would then go home to prepare breakfast for the children and get them ready for school. After that, she would go with her partner to their plot of land where they grow vegetables for sale. She would then return home at about 11 o'clock and begin preparing lunch. She'd spend some time purifying water for household consumption, and then she would attend to small animals and livestock around the homestead. She might fry some donuts or boil some eggs, which she would then go to sell at the market. She might spend her afternoon kernelling corn, not for the corn itself, but for the cobs, which she uses as fuel. At about 4 p.m., she would then pound some groundnuts and process other food which the house would need for consumption. And then she would spend some time washing dishes, washing clothes, and doing some general cleaning around the homestead. After that, she would go to the homestead garden to water the vegetables, pick some vegetables for dinner, and begin preparing the evening meal. Now, this would typically signal the end of Toko's day, but one important aspect of Toko's day that I haven't mentioned is that she is also continuously breastfeeding throughout the entire day. Now, the reason I wanted to share this story with you is to illustrate the multiple roles that women play in the food system. We can see that Toko is involved in production of food, processing of food. She's involved in business enterprises, but she's also quite significantly involved in ensuring that the household has quality diets. But we see that she also faces some challenges along the way, like the long queues that she has to stand in just to draw water. And these types of barriers really increase the time poverty that women have and limits their capacity to pursue their own ambitions. And it also has implications for women's health and well-being. So we've been working towards a food system to really try to understand what types of policy interventions can be implemented at each stage of the food system. And what we're finding is that there's some interventions that are specific to one component of the food system, and there are others that cut across several components of the food system. And many of these are hinged on women's access to resources and services. But we know that in many African societies, men control resources, and they're also the main decision makers. So along with access, we really need to think about interventions that support women's control over resources and also support the effective participation of women in certain services. But we also need to think about the formal structures that inform the food system. And these include governance structures. So for example, we need to think about legislation on women's right to access, use, and own land, as we've heard earlier. There are also certain social systems that might present barriers to women's equitable participation in the food system. And we really also need to understand this. So for example, we spoke already about decision-making. Now, it's not to say that no research has been done in any of these areas. In fact, a huge evidence base exists. However, this research is quite fragmented, and we don't understand how an intervention in one component of the food system might affect women's participation in another segment of the food system. So for example, some recent research evidence suggests that women's participation in economic activities actually limits the amount of time they have to prepare food. As a result, they're relying on convenient foods which are high in energy, but low in nutrients. And these have implications for household diets. They have implications for household members' health and well-being. So it's my hope that through the work that we are doing at FSNet Africa, or we will be doing at FSNet Africa, we'll begin to really look at the intersections of these types of interventions and really work towards a food system that supports Toko in meeting her ambitions and aspirations, but also in contributing significantly to national, global, and continental development goals. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think we often forget about the reality of Toko, and you've outlined it so clearly to really take us to this framework of trying to conceptualize a new framework for gender in African food systems. Thank you very, very much. The next panelist is Professor Margaret Mangeni from the Department of Agricultural Extension at Makerere University. She's also one of the steering committee members for award, and Margaret and I met each other about 10 or 15 years ago and have forgotten, and was very surprised 2 years ago when our paths crossed again. Thank you very much. Welcome, Margaret, and we look forward to your input on understanding barriers in the context of gender within agriculture and food systems.
Thank you very much, Franz, and I am very glad that I have the opportunity to address this gathering today. The subject of gender and institutionalization is dear to my heart. It's something that I have done since I graduated from university and joined Makerere University as a member of the faculty. And what I share with you today is partly from my experience championing gender integration into the curriculum in real life in a higher education institution, but also as I have been serving on various committees and initiatives in Africa on gender and making sure that the voice of women and the roles of women are integrated, but also for the last 5 years as a leader of a sub-Saharan African program called Gender Responsive Research as Equipped for Agricultural Transformation, which is equipping plant breeders with skills to practically implement or integrate gender in breeding programs. And my topic, as you saw, is on understanding barriers to institutionalization of gender within agricultural research. And I want to start off by, first of all, underlining the critical role that agricultural research institutions and higher education plays in food systems, so that as we have the goal of, as we embrace the goal of transformation of food systems, we are able to see that actually we can't achieve it without transforming agricultural research and higher education. It's critical for generating the innovations that are going to solve problems. I appreciate the example that Elizabeth shared about the typical life of an African woman. So the technologies that will make her life better come from agricultural research and higher education. And also the capacities for the researchers and other actors in the food system. Again, universities are critical in ensuring that the people that come out to work in the food system have the skills that are required, not just in their biophysical disciplines, but also in gender. And I like the statement that our keynote speaker, Wanjiru, mentioned. It's not optional that an agricultural researcher should have gender skills. It's integral, because they need to be able not just to know about gender, but to be able to apply it practically in their work. And that's the role of higher education. And then also evidence. Again, we've had evidence and data being mentioned now and again. That's the job of research and again, higher education. So these are institutions that we cannot afford to leave behind if we want to transform food systems. And I must also say that there is a lot of investment that has already gone into these institutions in terms of making sure that they are gender responsive. Support for research and sensitization, support in terms of policy and strategies, name it. However, despite all that investment that we see from governments, but more importantly from donors, we see that the gender gaps remain. And again, Wanjiru did a very good job in showing us those gaps in terms of access by men and women to technologies, adoption of access to services. So the gaps remain, and that means there are barriers. And that's an area that I think we need to interrogate, and which I want to take time. I have limited time, but I'll share a few points on some of the barriers that I have observed during my career, but also in a study that we conducted in Rwanda, Agricultural Board, and also National Agricultural Research Organization in my country, Uganda, but also as we work with scientists from all over Africa under the GREAT program. And institutionalization, the way I define it, this is when we say we are institutionalizing gender, it means that the rules, both formal and informal, that govern these institutions, that is agricultural research and higher education, intentionally recognize the sociocultural systems in which we are operating in sub-Saharan Africa, but also how these systems define and position men and women differently, and the inherent differences that this brings with regard to the needs of the men and women and the constraints that affect them as they engage in the food system. And one of the key barriers that I want to highlight, and which all of us who are working in these institutions know, is the way these institutions are organized, the structures and the rules of engagement within those organizations. For structures, as you know, most, if not all, African countries organize research organizations around commodities. You will have a research organization that is dealing with cereal grains, for example, or roots and tubers, and social sciences, or gender in particular, is in a corner of that institution. But the main mandate of that organization, that research organization, is defined in terms of the commodity. And therefore, because of that, you find that gender, which would help us, gender research, which would help us understand the sociocultural aspects of the commodity research and also its uptake in communities and in households, is not as adequately resourced and researched. And then you find, when we were conducting this study I talked about, funded by IDRC, one of the statements that came up from one of the gender focal person was that one barrier they face is that the organization in which they work is focusing on a commodity. In this case, it was roots and tubers. So when you come up, when you bring a research agenda, which is gender, it doesn't fit anywhere within the mandate of that organization. So you find that gender or social science in general is at the periphery. Universities or higher education are organized around disciplines. You find the Department of Crop Science, of Animal Science, Agriculture Economics, or Agriculture Extension. But then the focus is around disciplines. And you know, many times agricultural disciplines have, philosophies that underpin their work and what they call science. So when you bring in genders, many times it is not as emphasized, and sometimes it's trivialized. So it's important that as we think about transformation of food systems, we also look at transforming agriculture disciplines, what they consider to be priority research, what they consider to be science, and what they consider to be valid data. About institutions, and as I said, these are guidelines or policies, rules, and cultures that guide the operations of organizations in research. And one of the most important and actually key barrier is the invisible one, the informal rules that guide the way priorities are made, allocation of resources, recruitment. You find that this is unspoken, but in many cases it does not recognize the importance or the centrality of social science and gender research in particular. And therefore, when it comes to deciding where to spend resources, it's always the gender budget that is lowest. So you'll find, I'll give an example of the breeding programs, because those are the ones I've been working with a lot lately. There'll be mega dollars of funds allocated to generating a technology, for example. But when it comes to understanding the systems through which this technology will be delivered to the end users, that is extension, the budget will be very small. And yet, then when you reach to the level where you understand how the technology will be used at the household, and they need to be inclusive and not to exclude women and all those decision-making processes that happen at the household, that budget is even less. You find that on a research team that has a breeding program that probably has a budget of $1 million US, gender training or understanding social systems could be allocated $10,000 US, and therefore it cannot build the capacity of the research team. And another barrier, again, in the interest of time, I know Franz is about to come in here. I have 5 minutes. One of the barriers is the way in which gender has been introduced in research and agricultural institutions. It's often based on individuals who are champions. They believe that gender matters, and therefore they advocate for it to be brought in into the organization and considered. But we often don't see the follow through to trace it to until it is really fully embraced within the institution, and it ceases to be lip service or counting numbers of women and men served, but instead it's at the core of the operations of the organization, both agricultural research and higher education. So therefore, I would say that this pathway, while it's important going through the champions, it needs to be traced to really fully being embraced within the organizations and also institutions. And that means that accountability systems, reward systems within agricultural research and within higher education need to embrace gender. And at the core of it is really our capacities. Thank you very much. Franz, I know time is up, so I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. I think we really had an excellent panel with a broad introduction by Wanjiru, and then the case study by Justin, Elizabeth with a conceptual framework, and yourself with trying to understand and unpack the barriers in the context. I've noticed that there was a number of questions fielded. I have forwarded them on the chat function also to the panelists, and I see that they are responding. So in that context, I think we can move speedily over to Farai. As I mentioned, Farai Kapwatsarua is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. He's working closely with us in a number of areas of globalization, but also in food systems, agribusiness, entrepreneurship. Farai, we're looking forward to your summary of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz, and many thanks to all the presenters for such insightful and thought-provoking presentation. In the interest of time, I just have 4 main overarching points that I would like to share with you that came out for me from the presentations. I think the lead paper from Wanjiru, I think specifically highlighted that I think a lot of the research which is being done on global agricultural systems, I think it doesn't have focus on the particularities of African food systems, in that over 50% of smallholder agriculture production and consumption in Africa is accounted by women, and as such, women play a very important role in ensuring food security and reducing poverty in Africa. Therefore, we can never discuss a transformed agricultural system on the continent without recognizing the importance of gender inclusiveness across all agricultural value chains which are related to sustainable agricultural food production and food consumption. And I think Justin's presentation clearly highlighted, I think, the importance of women when he presented his discussion on cassava in West Africa, where he highlighted the importance of gender-inclusive participation in science policy discourses or decision-making to tackle food security on the continent. And one of the key institutions also, which is very important with regards to food systems on the continent, is higher education institutions, as well as research centers, which are responsible for creating knowledge, and also they have an important platform to bring together several actors which are involved in food systems. But the research, I think the presentation by Margaret, it highlighted that a lot of the institutional capacities at a lot of these higher education universities, as well as the research centers, is very much ineffective and insufficient to promote gender inclusive pathways. So therefore, it's very important for these higher education institutions to be reformed structurally to produce interdisciplinary platforms which allow for researchers to have the skills which are necessary to address the needs of women. And I think lastly, I think the presentation by Elizabeth really highlighted, I think, the importance of policy. And they have been several policy interventions across, at multiple levels, at national level, regional level, or international level, which try to integrate the gender issues. But Elizabeth's presentation particularly highlighted that there is a lack of interconnectedness in a lot of these interventions. Therefore, I think it's very important that these interlinkages and synergies within these policy interventions are interlinked to avoid silos, as what was presented in an earlier presentation. So in a nutshell, I think those are my 4 takeaways from the presentation. Thank you, Franz.
Thank you very much, Farai. You clearly identified the strategic pointers that will inform us in the way forward, and that we hopefully will finally also in the final synthesis report. Thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes left, so in that context, I think I will ask each one of the panelists, starting from the bottom with Margaret, then Elizabeth, then Justin, to make a final comment, and then ask Vanjiru, our lead paper, to also make a concluding comment. Thank you very much. Margaret?
Thank you very much, Franz. Mine is a call that as we look at the research agenda for food systems, we include an understanding of the institutions, especially the social cultural systems, because that's the root cause of the gender issues that we see and the gaps, and therefore bringing that to the fore so that we are really able to understand and how this influences us at the various levels of complexity of the food system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margaret. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Prof. So I think a lot has been said about the role of women, but critically important is also to understand the role of men in supporting gender equality within the food system. And I think Dr. Wanjiru alluded to men's participation in housework and care work. And I think that's really important to also understand that there's a critical role for men to play. In fact, there's a complementary role for men to play. Research in nutrition has actually shown that, as well as in gender-based violence. And so we really need to look at how positive masculinities can contribute to improving women's participation in the food system. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Justin?
Yes, I would like to really thank the organizer for including gender in the program. And as Elizabeth just said, men has a role to play in it, and we have to learn. And this is give us opportunity to learn, to understand, and to learn why we really need to include women in everything we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the whole panel. I really enjoyed moderating this panel, and I think it was an excellent framework that we have provided with our lead papers, with our panelists, and our summary at the end. We have, my apologies, Vanjiru. There we go. Thank you. Apologies. Thank you.
No, absolutely. No worries at all. I think it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this panel. I think some of the things that really stood out for me is really this focus on institutions and Professor Mangeni talked about not just the rules, but also the informal rules, the culture and of an organization and assumptions that we make. I really appreciate, and also just the comments. The view of women, women like Toko, understanding and connecting the dots, linking what Justin was saying with what Elizabeth was saying, how we understand the lived realities of women like Toko as being the end recipients of the kind of cassava research that Justin is leading, and really inspired by the way Justin is centering women in the growth of research. And all to say, I think it's going to be really important moving forward, and as we build more robust food systems, that we really appreciate that gender isn't a side add-on to the research process, but rather gendered consideration of gender roles, understanding of this, of gender roles, is essential to improving research outcomes, is essential to understanding who are we conducting research for. And in conclusion, I will say it's important to remember that, especially for the continent, for the African continent in particular, our researchers are called to have a mandate, not just around publishing and being excellent researchers, but being relevant researchers who are speaking to the challenges of women like Toko. I will conclude by saying a big thank you to the organizers, to you, Franz, to you, Aldo, who've pulled this together. Thank you again for bringing gender and the gender conversation to the center of this important one. Yeah. Let me conclude by saying thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Vanjiru, for those excellent concluding remarks. And as I've said, thank you very much to the whole panel. I think it was excellent. We have 5 minutes left before the next session starts.